All right, diving in today, folks. We're looking at workplace safety, specifically cranes, all things lifting slings, and those, personnel lifting baskets.
Right.
You shared some really interesting Osha stuff with me, and it's pretty in depth.
Yeah.
I mean, lots of good stuff in there.
It is.
So we're gonna kind of pick it apart today, see if we can make some sense of it for everyone out there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing that struck me as I was looking through it was just how it really emphasizes inspections.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just say, okay, we bought this new crane, it's safe, we're good to go. You really have to be vigilant. It's kind of like the pre-flight checklist on an airplane.
Right.
You do it every single time, and this is even more than that. I mean, we're talking daily, monthly, even annual inspections.
Yeah. So it starts from the beginning. So every day before you use a crane for the first time that day, got to inspect it.
Yeah.
And also after any repairs or modifications. So, if you change anything or fix anything, you got to inspect it again.
Exactly. You got to make sure everything is still in working order.
And then you've got like these tiers of inspection.
Yeah.
So daily.
Right.
Which is interesting because it's not just before you use it, it's even during.
Yeah.
It's like you got to be looking out while you're operating the crane for things like leaks in your air or hydraulic systems.
Yeah.
If your hook is deformed, anything like that, what really stands out to you about these really frequent checks?
Well, I think that the daily checks are, kind of like your first line of defense.
Yeah.
It's those obvious things that could go wrong that you can catch right away.
No.
You don't want to be in the middle of a lift and suddenly have a hydraulic hose burst.
Right.
And then the monthly inspections, those get a little bit more in depth.
Mm-hmm.
And importantly, you have to keep records of those. You have to have a paper trail of the inspection date, who did it, the serial number of the equipment. You got to check that hook. You got to do a test of the mechanical functions, make sure the wire rope conforms to the manufacturer's recommendations. All that stuff gets documented.
Yeah.
And that's really important for accountability, and just keeping track of the health of the crane.
So it's like a log book almost.
Exactly.
So you can kind of go back and see, okay, has this, been having a recurring problem?
Right.
Or is this a new issue?
Exactly. And then, of course, you've got your annual or periodic inspections.
Mm.
And those really go deep.
Mm-hmm.
They're looking for things like cracks in critical components, worn gears, any damage to the wire ropes themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And for those personal lifting baskets, the annual inspection also includes load testing. So, you're really giving it a thorough checkup.
Yeah, like a physical.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, in these deeper inspections, they're looking for potential weaknesses.
Yeah.
Things that might not be apparent in a daily check.
Right.
But could cause problems down the road.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So you're not just, trying to prevent something from happening right now. You're trying to make sure it stays safe for the long term.
Exactly.
So then when we move into actually lifting loads, the rules are very clear.
Mm-hmm.
First and foremost, never exceed that rated capacity.
Right. And that's the manufacturer's limit.
Mm-hmm.
They've designed it, they've tested it, they know what it can handle. Don't push it beyond that.
Yeah, you're asking for trouble. Also got to make sure those loads are balanced and secure.
Right. Yeah.
Use ropes that aren't twisted. That seems pretty straightforward. But I guess it's worth mentioning. And something that might not be so obvious is you can't pull a load sideways with a crane.
Right.
Unless it's specifically designed to do that.
Yeah, that's really important. Most cranes are designed for vertical lifting.
Right.
And if you start pulling sideways, you're putting a lot of strain on the crane that it's not meant to handle.
Yeah, you're putting stress on parts that aren't supposed to bear that stress.
Exactly.
So, we see those limit switches on cranes.
Mm-hmm.
What's the deal with those?
Those are really important safety devices, and OSHA is very specific about how they need to be tested.
Okay.
You have to test them at the beginning of every shift, and you do it without a load on the crane.
Mm-hmm.
And for those larger cranes, you got to operate them slowly during the test.
Okay.
And if a limit switch isn't working correctly, you got to report it immediately.
Gotcha.
Because those limit switches are there to prevent over travel. they're meant to stop the crane from going too far in any direction.
So it doesn't hit anything.
Exactly.
Right. Okay, that makes sense.
So yeah, very, very important safety devices. Now, moving on to wire rope slings.
Okay.
The message here is very clear.
Mm-hmm.
If it's damaged, if it's deformed, you can't use it.
Mm.
No shortcuts, no, trying to fix it with a bolt or not or anything like that. And twisting them is a big no-no.
Yeah, and I think it's worth emphasizing here that damage doesn't have to be like, a huge, obvious break.
Right, exactly.
Even small amounts of damage can really weaken the sling.
That's right. And that's why OSHA has those very specific removal criteria.
Right.
They say, for example, if you have 6 broken wires in one lay of the rope or 3 broken wires in one strand, that's it. It's done.
Okay.
Or if the diameter of the rope is reduced by more than 1/3 of the original outer diameter because of core failure, again, you got to remove it.
Wow.
Kinking, crushing, bird caging, any damage that distorts the rope,
Mm-hmm.
you got to take it out of service.
Gotcha.
And if there's any evidence of heat damage, that's another big one.
Okay.
You got to remove it. And the safety factor for steel wire ropes, according to OSHA, is 5-to-1.
Okay.
So that tells you there's a significant margin of safety built in.
Mm-hmm.
But damage eats away at that margin.
Gotcha. So you're really looking for, those more subtle signs, not just the really obvious stuff.
Exactly.
Okay. And then when you are using slings, you've got to have things like load distributors, anti-slip devices,
Mm-hmm.
and, make sure the sling's properly secured to the load.
Right.
Protecting the wire rope from sharp edges.
Yeah, you don't want it to get cut or frayed.
Yeah. I mean, these next two, they almost seem like common sense, but I guess it's worth saying out loud.
Mm-hmm.
Keep people away from anything that's suspended. And don't get your hands caught when you're tightening.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's easy to get focused on what you're doing and not realize that your hand is in a dangerous spot.
Right.
So always be aware of where your hands are in relation to the load and the sling.
And that daily inspection of all the slings.
Yes.
By someone who knows what they're doing. That's essential, right?
Absolutely. That's another one of those frontline defenses. You got to catch any damage before it can lead to an accident.
Okay. And if you find damage during the operation or during maintenance, it's got to be removed right then?
Right. No exceptions.
Okay. So let's kind of zoom out a little bit.
Okay.
Talk about cranes and hoists more generally.
Mm-hmm.
First and foremost, they have to be, built well, maintained well, and free of defects.
Right. That's kind of the foundation of everything. You got to have a good, solid piece of equipment to start with.
Yeah. And those drums and pulleys, I learned a new word, sheaves. Those have to be, the right size and type for the rope or chain that you're using.
You can't just use any old sheave. It has to be compatible with the lifting mechanism you're using.
And then of course you've got the operators.
Yes.
They have to be qualified, they have to know what they're doing, and they have to follow instructions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The operator is like the pilot of this machinery.
Right.
They need the training. They need the experience to handle it safely.
Yeah. They're responsible for a lot.
They are. And the brakes on these machines, those are critical.
Mm.
They have to be able to hold and control the maximum rated load. And that annual thorough testing, that we talked about before, that applies to the brakes too.
Right.
You got to make sure those brakes are in good working order.
Mm-hmm. And for cranes that are lifting people, you've got those added safety measures.
Right.
Like those enclosed cages and emergency stops.
Yeah, those are absolutely essential. You're dealing with human life here.
Right.
So you got to have those extra layers of protection.
Yeah. And it's not just, what's happening up in the air.
Mm-hmm.
There are also rules about, the ground around winches. You got to have barricades to protect the workers.
Yeah.
Tag lines, those ropes that they use to control loads.
Mm-hmm.
You got to use those instead of your hands.
Right. You never want to use your hands to try to guide a load. It's just too dangerous.
And the person who's signaling the winch operator,
Yeah.
they have to be in a safe spot with a way to get out if they need to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They can't be standing right underneath the load or in a position where they could get trapped.
Right.
They need to have a clear escape route.
So it's really about minimizing risk at every level.
Exactly.
From the operator to the people on the ground to the equipment itself.
Right. And speaking of minimizing risk, that minimum distance from overhead power lines. That's another really important one.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to get anywhere near those power lines with a crane.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty obvious one.
It does, but accidents happen. So it's really important to be aware of your surroundings and make sure you're staying well clear of those power lines.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So we've talked about wire rope slings.
Right.
Are there other types of slings?
Yes, there are. There are metal chain slings and synthetic web slings.
Okay. So with all slings, regardless of what they're made of, what are some of the kind of universal rules that apply?
Well, the core principles are the same. Never use a damaged sling. Don't try to shorten it improperly by knotting it or anything like that. Avoid kinking and never exceed the load rating.
Mm-hmm.
Those are kind of the golden rules of sling safety.
Mm-hmm.
When you're using a basket hitch, which is a specific way of rigging a sling, you got to make sure the load is balanced.
Okay.
And you always want to use padding under the sling when you're lifting something with sharp edges.
Right, to protect the sling.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And again, keep people away from the lifted loads and hands clear during rigging. Don't put your hands between the sling and the load.
Right. Okay, so metal chain slings.
Yeah.
How are those different?
Well, one of the advantages of metal chain sling is that it can conform to the shape of the load.
Okay.
So it kind of wraps around the load more snugly. And they're also very good for lifting hot loads, things that a synthetic sling might melt under. But they are susceptible to breakage from sudden movement or shock loading.
Okay.
So you got to be really careful about that.
So no jerking or anything like that?
Exactly. And another thing to keep in mind with chain slings is that if one part fails, the whole thing can fail.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, you could have one link that breaks and then the whole sling comes apart and the load drops.
So every link is critical.
Exactly. So regular inspection is even more important with chain slings.
Okay. And how do you inspect a chain sling?
Well, each chain should have a little plate on it that indicates its rated capacity.
Sure.
So you want to make sure you're not exceeding that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you do a visual and external inspection.
Okay.
You're looking for any signs of damage, any cracks, any wear and tear.
Okay.
It's a good idea to measure the chain length before you use it for the first time and record that measurement.
Okay.
And then you can compare that measurement to future measurements to see if the chain has stretched. Because stretching can be a sign that the chain is weakening.
Okay.
And then you also want to measure the diameter of the chain at the most worn point and compare that to a wear chart.
Okay.
And the wear chart will tell you, at what point the chain needs to be removed from service.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like a go, no-go gauge for a chain.
Exactly.
Okay. And what about synthetic web slings?
Yeah, those are becoming more and more popular. But the big thing with those is heat.
Okay.
They're very susceptible to heat damage. So if you see any signs of burning or melting, you got to take it out of service immediately.
Gotcha. Okay, so last thing then, personnel lifting baskets.
Yes, right.
I get the feeling that OSHA is pretty strict about those.
They are, yeah.
And I think it's for good reason.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, you're talking about people's lives here.
Right. Yeah. OSHA is very clear that you should only use a crane-suspended personnel platform when there's no other safer method available. So, if there's any other way to do the job, you got to do it that way.
Okay.
But if you have to use a personnel basket, there are a lot of requirements.
Okay.
Both for the crane itself and for the basket.
Okay. So for the crane, what are we talking about?
Well, first of all, the crane has to be on firm, level ground.
Okay.
No more than a 1% slope.
Okay.
You got to move the crane slowly and carefully. The brakes have to be engaged during operation. All the safety devices have to be working properly.
Right.
And the total weight of the basket and its contents can't exceed 50% of the crane's rated capacity.
Wow. Okay. So you got to really be well within that limit.
Yeah, you got to have a big safety margin.
Okay.
And you also got to take into account the boom angle and the radius.
Okay. And the operator.
Yes.
Where do they need to be?
They have to be inside the control cap at all times when the basket is occupied.
Okay. No exceptions.
No exceptions. And there are also some specific pieces of equipment that the crane needs to have.
Okay.
A boom angle indicator.
Okay.
That has to be clearly visible to the operator. A boom extension and load radius indicator.
Okay.
And a limit switch that prevents the block from contacting the boom tip.
So it doesn't like swing up and hit the top of the crane.
Exactly.
Okay. And then the basket itself.
Right.
What kind of rules apply there?
Well, first of all, the basket has to be designed by a qualified and certified engineer.
Okay.
And it has to be designed to withstand its own weight plus 5 times the intended load.
Wow. Okay.
So, that includes the people and any equipment they're carrying.
Mm-hmm.
There are also specific requirements for the construction of the basket. It has to have a top rail, a mid rail, and a toe board.
Okay.
Mesh or solid paneling from the toe board to the mid rail.
Mm-hmm.
And any openings in that paneling can't be more than ½ inch.
Okay.
There has to be an interior grab rail near the top rail.
Mm-hmm.
A plate that indicates the basket weight and the maximum capacity.
Right.
A secure inward swinging self-latching door that can't open during lifting.
Okay.
A protective top, a roof of adequate height.
Mm.
All the welding has to be done by a certified welder.
Okay.
And there can't be any sharp or pointed edges on any of the materials.
Gotcha.
So, they've really thought of everything to make these baskets as safe as possible.
Yeah.
And anyone who's inside the basket has to wear head protection.
Okay.
A hard hat.
And then inspection and testing of the basket, what's involved there?
Well, the basket has to be inspected before each use.
Mm-hmm.
You got to do a trial lift with approximately the actual load to all the expected work locations. You got to make sure all the crane and basket operating and safety devices are working properly.
Mm-hmm.
You got to confirm that the load at the intended boom angle and radius doesn't exceed 50% of the crane's rated capacity.
Right.
And you got to inspect the lifting ropes for any defects and make sure they're properly spooled on the drum.
Okay.
And then you got to do a visual inspection of the crane and the basket by a competent person.
Okay. So that's like, before you even put anyone in the basket.
Right, exactly. You got to make sure everything is in good working order. And then there's load testing.
Okay.
So the employer has to make sure that the basket and the lifting devices are proof tested to 125% of the rated capacity in certain situations.
Okay.
So that would be before the first use of the basket.
Okay.
After any repairs or modifications.
Right.
And before you lift personnel.
Okay. And how does that test work?
Well, you basically lift the loaded basket and hold it for 5 minutes.
Wow.
Yeah. So you're really putting it through its paces.
Yeah, you're making sure that it can handle, even more weight than it's supposed to.
Exactly.
Okay. And then so someone's in the basket, it's being lifted. What are some of the safety rules that apply then?
Well, you got to use a tagline to control the movement of the basket.
Okay.
All body parts have to stay inside the basket during lifting and lowering.
Mm-hmm.
You got to make sure the basket is secured before you enter or exit.
Okay.
If there are any signs of danger, you got to stop work immediately.
Okay.
And that includes things like wind speeds exceeding 25 miles per hour.
Wow. Okay.
The crane operator has to remain at the controls at all times.
Mm-hmm.
The personnel in the basket have to be visible to the operator or a signal person.
Right.
And the personnel in the basket have to use fall protection. So that's a harness and lanyard attached to the crane's headache ball.
Okay. Wow. So it's a lot.
It is. It is. But, it's all about safety.
Right.
When you're lifting people, you can't take any chances.
Yeah. It's interesting when you look at all of this together, it's really like a layered defense against accidents.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Each regulation, each inspection point, it's there to catch a specific type of hazard.
Yeah. And really prevent something bad from happening.
Exactly.
So I think, for anyone listening, hopefully now you have a good understanding of, what's involved in doing this kind of work safely.
Yeah, absolutely. And it all comes back to those OSHA guidelines.
Right.
They're very detailed, they're very comprehensive, and they're there for a reason.
Yeah.
To keep people safe.
Mm-hmm. So really the takeaway is, a safe lifting operation, it's not just about luck.
Right.
It's about following these rules.
It is. It's about being diligent. It's about paying attention to detail. And it's about having a culture of safety.
Yeah. I think that's well said.
Thank you.
So on that note, I'll leave you with this thought. There are so many of these safety protocols. What do you think is, maybe the one or two most impactful daily habits that people can develop to, really reduce that risk of accidents? I mean, how do you take all these rules, all these regulations, and translate them into, practical everyday actions?
That's a really good question.
Yeah. Something to think about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
My pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
Sounds good.